Hello again, this is Josh Daum, Office Administrator for the Presbytery of the Western Reserve, and this is a video to show you a couple of security features and best practices to help keep your Zoom gatherings secure. With the increased use of Zoom by just like a lot of people, like everyone's on Zoom now, it has also received increased attention from that oldest of internet foes, the troll. That's right, it's not enough that they have destroyed the usefulness of comment sections across the internet. Now they're coming for your committee meetings, your virtual happy hours, and your family game nights. But don't worry, our friends over at Zoom have added a number of features to help you keep your meetings secure. Now, some of you may remember a number of weeks ago, I released this video on the in-meeting controls, but my goodness, just look at him. With his optimism and his careless password-free meeting setups and his beautiful full beard, he clearly does not know what lies in store. I'm only kidding. My point is that that video on the in-meeting controls didn't include the security button or a couple of other controls that I want to go into in a different video. But in this one, I'm going to stick to the security button and setting up a meeting using a password, which was also absent from the previous setup video that I did. So with that, let's get started. Okay, so here we are in the Zoom meeting. You'll notice that as opposed to the previous videos where it was just me in the meeting, I have added two other people, one who is named Nice Person and one who is named Nefarious Troll. Nice Person is clearly trying too hard. I'm not sure that I trust him. No, I'm just kidding. I added these other two participants, which if you want a little peek behind the scenes, they're all me on different accounts, but I've added them into this meeting so that I could show you some of the in-meeting controls that pertain to security. So there's a thing that has been happening to people using Zoom, us included actually, which is called Zoom bombing. And it's basically when someone who does not belong in your video conference gains access to your video conference and starts, let's just say, being disruptive, sharing things on your screen that you don't want on your screen. And in response, Zoom has changed. They added the security button that we'll get to in a moment, but they've changed some of their default features. So now when you set up a meeting, by default the waiting room is turned on, and by default the meeting password is turned on. And we'll get to that a little bit later in the video. But right now, I want to show you the security button. So similarly, if I pull up my Manage Participants panel, I've got all of these here, and basically what the security button does is it takes some stuff that you have here and puts it in one place where it's easy to get at it. So I could, for example, I could ask this person to start their video. I could make them the host. I could rename them. I could put them in the waiting room. I could remove them, and I can do all that in the Participants panel. But this big shield and the word security is pretty easy to find. And let me tell you, having been in a situation where somebody invaded a meeting with lots of people in it and started, again, let's just say being disruptive, that moment you're probably not going to feel calm and like you're going to want to go searching through menu options. So having a big shield that says security is a pretty big help. So I'm going to click on that. And you'll notice that I've got some choices here. I can lock the meeting. That prevents anybody else from joining. I can enable or disable the waiting room. I'll get into the waiting room in another segment of this video. And I can turn on whether or not other participants can rename themselves, share their screens, and chat. And finally, down at the bottom here, this is the one that if you are thrown into it and somebody starts disrupting your meeting, this is the one you're going to want. You're going to want remove participant. So first of all, we are going to remove the nefarious troll, and you just click remove. It asks you if you're sure. It does tell you that they will not be able to rejoin the meeting, which is good, because presumably if you're kicking the person out, it's because they don't belong there. You click remove, and they're gone. Suddenly, it's just me and Nice Person, which is lovely. And so that's pretty much all the features that you'll need in the security button. Okay, so here I am back in the meeting. You'll notice I'm in here by myself now. That's because I wanted to show you the waiting room. So the waiting room is now enabled by default when you set up a meeting or when you start a meeting, unless you go out of your way to disable it. So I want to show you what happens. So I'm going to join this meeting from a different device and a different account. I'm going to punch in the meeting password here, which you can't see because it's on a different device. We'll get to passwords in a moment, I promise. And I'm joining. And what happens now is I get this little notification here that says, nice person has entered the waiting room for this meeting. So I'm going to click. Now, if you knew the person who was coming and their name was displayed and you were reasonably well assured that they were supposed to be there and who they said they were going to be, you could just click admit. But I want to show you the waiting room. And basically what this does is it brings up the participants panel, but it has one person is waiting, and that basically is a little bit of a holding area. So the idea, this is a password protected meeting, but it is not impossible to conceive that the password could be guessed by a person who is trying to invade your meeting, or somebody might have shared the meeting link with someone else that they should not have been sharing it with. Those things are less likely, but they're not impossible. So this is basically just an additional feature here. You have the option to message that person. So for example, folks who don't have Zoom accounts or who have not set up their Zoom accounts fully might show up as owner. That's a thing that happens. Like if instead of their name, it just says owner because they are the owner of the account and presumably the owner of the device that they're on, and that is the default value. But it doesn't tell you anything about who is coming, who's trying to come into your meeting. And so what you end up with is sometimes display names that don't tell you a whole lot about who's waiting. So if, for example, I wasn't expecting somebody named nice person and didn't recognize this, I could message them and say, hi, welcome, but who is this? Just staying, oh goodness, just staying safe. That message would go to them. It would show up on their chat window. They could respond to you, and you could see whether or not that person was who you were expecting and whether they belong. Let's say that I have vetted this person and I believe that they are supposed to be here. I can say admit. And just like that, nice person has entered the meeting. Going back to manage participants here, under more options here, I can actually put this person back in the waiting room. There are a number of reasons you might do that, actually. If you were interviewing a candidate and you wanted to have a discussion about that person without them being able to listen, you could kick them back out to the waiting room. And then you could, of course, just readmit them when the time was. It's a pretty useful feature, not just for screening participants, but there are plenty of use cases where you might find that helpful within a meeting. And so that is just sort of a brief summary of the waiting room. One last part about the in-meeting security control. Before we switch over to some of the added security features that you should probably be making use of when you are scheduling your Zoom meetings, I wanted to bring your attention back to the security panel, or the security control here, rather. Down at the bottom here, this is where you determine whether or not participants are allowed to share their screens, chat, or rename themselves. The one you might want to disable by default, depending on the type of meeting it is, depending on what you're all planning on doing, you might want to disable share screen. The Zoom bombers that I was telling you about before, that is sort of their their weapon of choice, is to share their screens and basically take over the meeting and display inappropriate content to everyone in the meeting. So if you disallow that, if you make it so that participants are not able to share their screen, it means that even if somebody dips into your meeting, they're not going to be able to share their screen. Now, of course, that doesn't stop them from holding their phone up to their webcam or anything else like that, but it is something that you can do to keep yourself a little more secure, add a little bit of a layer of protection there. You do probably want to leave chat enabled. I mentioned before that when someone was waiting in the waiting room, that you could chat with them to find out who they were and why they were trying to join the meeting. But if chat is disabled, then they are not going to be able to answer you, which isn't particularly helpful if you're asking them questions. All right, so here we are on the scheduling page. How to navigate here, we actually covered in the previous video about navigating your Zoom account and how to schedule a meeting. The short of it is that you would go to zoom.us, you would log into your account, and then there's a blue button that says Schedule New Meeting, and you would just click on that. But what I want to go over is some of the new default settings that come along with the enhanced security that Zoom has instituted to protect our Zoom meetings in this sort of new situation we find ourselves in. So a lot of the stuff I covered in a previous meeting, I'm not going to go over it again here. We're not going to change the topic or enter a description. All of that is covered in the previous scheduling video. I want to focus on the new stuff here. So go down to this registration link here. You can require that folks register for the meeting ahead of time, and then you have settings under that that will allow you to automatically approve registration or go in and manually approve registration. That's a way that you can sort of vet the folks who are going to be showing up at your meeting. The way it works is until the registration is approved, either automatically or manually by you, they do not receive a meeting link to get into the meeting. So, we're going to go over the password here and how the link has an embedded password, but the unfortunate sort of security loophole in that is that if a person shares that meeting link, that's basically one-click access to the meeting. Of course, there is the waiting room where you can screen folks out that way, but registration is sort of an added layer, and to be honest, it's a little bit, the settings are such that I would rather do a separate video of that and devote sort of the appropriate amount of attention and detail and thoroughness rather than try to cover it very quickly in this video. So just know, for our purposes right now, you can require registration and then you can determine whether or not the registration is going to be approved automatically or if it's going to be approved manually by you. So the first, or I should say the next thing I want to call your attention to is this meeting ID here. Now I did cover in the previous registration video, I said it was a best practice to say generate automatically rather than using your personal meeting ID. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them, at least the one I gave before I was thinking too much about security here, but one of them was that for example, we have an organizational account. Our organization has multiple different groups that all sometimes use our Zoom account. And so if we used our personal meeting ID every time, you might be thinking you're clicking into the Committee on Document Margin Width meeting and accidentally end up in the Educators Roundtable meeting if you get your times wrong. There is no Committee on Document Margin Width. That's just a joke I make, sorry. Anyway, if you generate automatically, it means that it's not the same link every time, which means there are fewer opportunities for crossed wires. That remains true. The new thing I want to call your attention to is if you are always using your personal meeting ID for every scheduled meeting, it's a persistent ID that's basically going to be in use over and over and over and over again for every meeting that you schedule. And so if I'm a nefarious troll and I notice that your personal meeting ID, not only is your personal meeting ID not password protected, but your personal meeting ID is frequently in use by multiple groups, I might be a repeat nefarious troll. I might be hiding under all of the bridges that you that you come across. So I might be a repeat customer. And so, it's a better practice to say generate automatically. Now, I do want to say the personal meeting ID is useful. I don't want to say that it's not useful. But basically, what I think of it as, the way I have talked about it before, is that it's really the digital equivalent of sort of walking up to somebody's desk and saying, hello, and having a face-to-face conversation. It is very useful for a quick, click because I need to talk to such and such, and I'd rather see their face than text or email. And you can still use the waiting room in conjunction with that rather than requiring a password, because that would sort of defeat the purpose of having it be a quick meeting. That was a bit of an aside. I take basically every opportunity I can get to call attention to the fact that we have some really incredible tools available to us. And the longer we are in this situation, this sort of shelter-at-home situation, the more we need to be making use of them. Because if you're a person who's accustomed to just sort of like popping into your coworker's office and having a quick conversation, we can still do an equivalent of that. And that, for me, for my money, that is what the personal meeting ID is for. Anyway, back to scheduling meetings. It's a best practice when you're doing a scheduled meeting to generate the meeting ID automatically. Okay. So next up is the meeting password. It used to be that by default the password was not required. Now the new default is that the password is required, and that's for the reasons that I sort of went over at the beginning of this video. More people are using Zoom now. It's got more attention, and so some folks are trying to disrupt other people's gatherings. So what you have here is a 6-digit automatically generated password, or it's 6 digits for now. It might be some other higher number of digits later. That is probably fine. Typically when I am scheduling a meeting, I like to mix it up a little, because if you are just using a numeric password, it is more susceptible to what is called a brute force attack. A brute force attack is just when a person who wants access to an electronic resource they don't have access to, because they don't have the password or the combination or the code or whatever, they just try every combination, not manually, of course, it's a piece of software, tries every combination until it finds the right one. With a purely numeric password, there are, of course, a very limited number of combinations, which leaves it somewhat susceptible to a brute force attack. Now, in fairness, there are plenty of unprotected meetings out there, and if I'm an attacker, if I'm a nefarious troll, I'm probably just going to save myself some effort and just focus on the meetings that are not protected, rather than putting extra effort trying to crack the password on this one meeting. Actually, while we're on the subject of brute force attacks, I do want to make a point here. We don't publish our meeting links on our calendar anymore for security reasons. The reality is that most of these attacks are probably not targeted attacks. Most of these attacks are probably brute force attacks where, we talked before, or I talked before about the meeting ID or the meeting URL, the zoom.us/j/meeting ID, whatever that is, whatever 9 or 10 digit number that is. The reality is those are easy to spoof. You could just pick numbers. And if you were a piece of software that could pick a lot of numbers very, very quickly, you could probably return a bunch of valid meetings that you could get into. And so that is the majority of these Zoom bombings, these invasions of meetings. That's how they're being perpetrated. They are mostly not targeted attacks. But with that being said, it doesn't hurt to be sort of extra vigilant. So it's a best practice not to publish your meeting URLs on your website or on public-facing Google Calendars, and have people contact you if they want to join. And there actually are ways to do that, even if it's a sort of a public y'all come kind of gathering, like a Zoom coffee hour, like the ones that we do. And I can actually go over that a little bit later in the video. But for now, now that I've gone off on several tangents. So back to brute force attacks and meeting passwords. This 6-digit password is probably fine. I like to mix it up a little and add some alphabetical and other special characters to the password. It basically increases the number of possible combinations and makes it a little bit harder for a piece of software to try all the combinations until they find one. All right. So moving down to the video, host and participant on and off, this is how things will begin. So this is the default setting in the video. We typically do not have extremely large gatherings. For the vast majority of the meetings that we have, we're talking about 15, maybe 20 participants. And so leaving the participants video on by default is fine. Most of the time, I'm usually able to keep track of who's on screen. But you can set those as you see fit. If you are starting the meeting early so that people can join, and then you're leaving the room, you might want to leave your video off by default so that you don't just have the computer staring at the wall. So you can set that as you see fit. Audio is the same. I recommend leaving it to both. That way people who aren't able to join with computer audio can still call in by phone. Okay, down to meeting options. So enable join before host is something that we do with most of our meetings. Basically, that is whether or not people will be in just sort of a limbo before the host joins the meeting. A lot of times I'll schedule a meeting for a committee that is in the evening after I get off work, and so there won't necessarily be a host at that meeting. And so enable join before host is necessary in that case. The waiting room
If you can use these two in conjunction, I recommend doing it. The during the day meetings, I leave the waiting room enabled because that allows a little bit of extra leeway in terms of screening participants. That way, if somebody did share the link with somebody by mistake that wasn't supposed to get it and it got posted on Twitter or whatever, however you suspect somebody might have gotten a hold of this link, it allows you to sort of screen and make sure that the people who are joining your meeting are the people who are supposed to be there and not people who are going to be disruptive. Okay. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that I will often schedule evening meetings at which no host is present. Of course, in that case, you would have to disable the waiting room because only a host can let folks into the meeting from the waiting room. And so if there's no host present, then you will need to leave the waiting room off, or else people are just going to be sort of in electronic limbo throughout the entirety of the meeting. But if it's a meeting during the day and there is going to be a host present, I recommend leaving both of these checked. And then only authenticated users can join. What that does is it requires the users to sign into Zoom. So right now, you can join via the Zoom web client and just punch in your name, and not have to have a Zoom account, not even have to download Zoom necessarily, and you can decide whether or not. We usually leave that unchecked because we do have a variety, a lot of different people who are joining, a lot of whom, we use Zoom all the time now. It's how we do, now that our phones are based in Zoom now too, it's how we do most of our work communication. So we sort of, eat, sleep, and breathe Zoom. Not everybody does. And so you might want to leave that authenticated users option unchecked. That way, folks who maybe they're on this one committee and that's the only thing they use Zoom for, they'll still be able to join and they don't have to sign up for an account. And so that is just sort of an overview of some of the enhanced security options that are available when you are scheduling your Zoom meeting. Okay, in the last section of the video here, I want to talk about the meeting invitation. Now, not the process of inviting someone to a meeting, that's pretty much unchanged, but the invitation itself. So if you watched the other video on scheduling Zoom meetings, this should look pretty familiar to you, although there are a couple of differences. So remember, we did set a meeting password and it is hidden by default, but you can just click show and see that. And you can see that I added some extra characters, some alphabetic characters and some special characters in to mix things up a little. Now I'm going to go down to the join URL here and you will see that it's longer than before. It still starts with https://zoom.us/j/ and then the meeting ID, which you can still see here, 973-8827-4171. And then it has a question mark and a PWD, which is short for password, equals, and then you will notice there is a long string of characters here that is not the password. What that is, this is a link that has an embedded password, and the embedded password is encoded. So you couldn't look at that link and see right away what the password was. It's hidden, but the Zoom sort of behind the scenes software is able to decode that into the password. So just like before, all you have to do is copy this entire link and distribute that to the folks who are going to be in the meeting, and they will be able to get in. Now, that means that this is one-click access to your meeting. If you enable the waiting room, which I did when I set up this meeting, they will still go into the waiting room when they join, but just be aware that if this link is shared with folks who do not belong, they will have access at least to the waiting room. And you can filter them out at that point. But it's a best practice not to share this with anybody who doesn't need to see it. So for example, we no longer put meeting links up on our public Google Calendar. It's a little bit of a bummer that we're not able to do that anymore. It was sort of the nice golden days of Zoom when we could be so cavalier about that. But I would recommend not putting this up on public calendars, not putting it up on your website, and having folks contact you, even if you are doing sort of public gatherings. We do some of those, and it's a little bit cumbersome and it's an extra step. But what we've started doing is having folks email us who want to join in with our Zoom coffee hours. And so it is an extra step, but it keeps our meetings a little more secure. So you will notice that you still have the meeting ID here, and you've got the password here. You can also just distribute that. So for example, I can email someone let's say someone who's very familiar with Zoom and is comfortable using the desktop client or the mobile app to join a meeting. I can send them this meeting ID and password. They can punch in the meeting ID. They will be asked for the password. They can punch that in and they will be let into the waiting room. Similarly, if we just took this first part of the link, zoom.us/j/the meeting ID, so that's sort of what the old invite link looked like. If we just took that and put it into a browser and launched it, it would ask us to open Zoom. It would put us into the meeting, and then we would be prompted for the password. So there's actually a good amount of flexibility here. If people are comfortable using the desktop client to enter that way, that's wonderful. But they really do make it easy with this link with the embedded password in it. Over here, I'm going to go to copy the invitation. And remember, this was the sort of long form invitation that you could email to folks or use in whatever messaging app or however you communicate. And it has all the same information in it that is on the screen. One thing I want to call your attention to down here is you've got your dial by your location, that join by phone info for folks who are not joining the video portion of the conference, maybe people who don't have access to a computer or don't have a computer with a webcam. You'll notice there's the meeting ID here, that's the same. Here's the password. You'll see that is not the same as the password. Oops, that's not the same as the password up here. And the reason for that is because if I'm punching things into a phone dial pad, it's going to be cumbersome to enter ampersands and asterisks and capital P's and all that kind of stuff. So what Zoom has done is if you do enter alphabetic characters or if you enter special characters into your password, it generates a separate password that has digits in it for folks who are joining by phone. And once again, you can copy this meeting invitation. In the other video, I showed you ways you can edit it down to make it a little less chaotic to look at. I'm not going to repeat that here because we've already covered that in another video. But that is the sort of updated invitation that has the link with the embedded password, the password in the invitation text. All right, I mentioned in the previous segment of the video that we have stopped publishing the links to our Zoom meetings on our Google Calendar. Previously, if a committee was meeting entirely or in part by Zoom, I would just put the link to the Zoom meeting on our public-facing Google Calendar, which was available on the website, which, gosh, just seemed like the smartest thing in the world at the time, and looking back, it seems so very, very foolish. And that's all fine. With committee meetings, you've got meeting reminders that go out. Only certain people are invited to those anyway. And so it's not a big deal to not publish those on the calendar. It makes it a little less convenient for folks to find them if they lose track of them, but that's all right. The part where it's kind of a bummer is we recently started doing these Zoom coffee hours, and the whole point of a Zoom coffee hour is anybody can show up, just like a coffee hour at church might be. And so, for example, this is the link that you might see. We might put this up on Twitter, or we might put this on our newsletter or on the website. So I do want to sort of go over what I've come up with as an alternative that allows it's not one click anymore, but a sort of not entirely inelegant version of distributing advertised kind of invitation. So we've talked before about the format of a Zoom meeting URL. So this is what it might have looked like before. Now these have embedded passwords in them, and I will go over that in another segment of this video. But I do want to talk just very quickly about this. So let me show you what happens here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to select this. Now I'm using Google Docs to do this. This would be similar in an email client or whatever word processor or most of the text editors that you're going to be using for communication. I could go over the actual HTML code, but I think it's not going to be super useful for most people because most of the software that we're using to do this stuff does it automatically for us. So let's imagine this was an email or I was formatting a document or formatting some text for the newsletter or whatever. I would click Insert Link, and I could paste the copied link there. And when I click that, it's going to go to that sort of join. And we've seen this before, and we could click open Zoom meetings, and if that were the, that's the personal meeting ID, but if that were the actual link for the scheduled meeting, it would take us to that. Now, I mentioned that the links now have embedded passwords, and it would look like something like this, and then you'd have a bunch of gobbledygook. It's not that, but something like that, which is the encoded password. The problem is, if we were to publicize this, we would be giving basically one-click access to our meeting to absolutely everybody who saw it. So up on Twitter or Facebook or in the church newsletter, or to whomever people are forwarding their emails, etc., all of those folks would have one-click access to at least the waiting room. And you could go ahead and do that and just screen folks out in the waiting room, but there is the possibility that somebody in the waiting room might be able to trick you into thinking that they are someone who belongs in your meeting, and then they'll get in and perhaps start disrupting your meeting. So here is what I have come up with to do instead. So that's our fake meeting link with the embedded password. So here's what I've come up with instead. Mostly when you look inside a browser URL bar, when you type in www.google.com or www.preswesres.org, you're basically typing a command in. Go to this page, go to this page, go to this page, and that is what that command says to the browser, and the browser knows how to interpret that. Okay, so I'm going to show you another command that you may or may not be aware of that will sort of help us get around this. You create what's called a mail to link. So we're going to say mail to pwrinfo@preswesres.org, and we're going to hit our question mark, and we're going to say subject equals Zoom coffee hour. Now, it did try to make that into a link all on its own. I'm actually going to remove that because I want to show you this. Okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy this, and I'm going to edit this link, and I'm going to put it in there instead. Okay? And so now I'm going to click it, and we're going to show you what happens. So we're going to go to that link, and it's going to open a new email that goes to pwrinfo@preswesres.org with the subject already put in Zoom Coffee Hour. And so basically what you can do is you can edit your link text so that instead of saying something like click here to join us, you could say click here to email us if you want to join. And so then the folks know that what's happening when they click that is it's going to open an email. And so now that that email is open, I can say, I'd love to join. Please send me the link. And we can send that. And that's going to go off to pwrinfo@preswesres.org, or whatever email address you want it sent to. It could be your individual email address or your office email, however you want to do that. And so basically it adds an extra step. So now you're going to be getting a bunch of emails, and you're going to have to send out the meeting link. But the upshot of that is that you know who is getting that meeting link. And of course, it still doesn't stop people from sharing that link far and wide with others, but you can encourage them not to do so. And the reality is that most people aren't even going to need to be encouraged not to do so, because the folks who are coming to your y'all come type meetings are probably folks who want those meetings to be successful. So you can use your judgment about that. Of course, you know your organization far better than I do. So that is sort of a workaround we've found to allow, to have a publicly sort of broadcastable link that we can send people that still does not allow them one-click access to the meeting, but allows us to be able to get the meeting URL to the folks who want to join.
Since the beginning of the shelter-in-place order, we have seen a huge number of folks in our churches who have been willing to innovate and experiment and try new things, step out of their comfort zones, and learn pieces of technology that they might not have learned otherwise. And, that kind of energy can be difficult to maintain when there are groups of people out there who are actively trying to ruin your day. But the reality is that those people are a noisy, if unpleasant, minority. And the majority of Zoom users are just trying to conduct their committee meetings and their family game nights in peace. So any encouragement you can take to sort of help you maintain that spirit of exploration and that spirit of stepping out of your comfort zone is going to be a positive thing. Speaking personally, having been in a meeting that I was sort of facilitating that was Zoom bombed, I I took it hard. I was very upset by it. It actually ruined the rest of my day, and I was very fortunate to be in the meeting with colleagues who were understanding and luckily all adults and people who were not traumatized by the experience, and they responded with a lot of humor and kindness toward me. And it actually took me another day to get there myself, but I did get there. I actually created this graphic, which I think was sort of my way of kind of coping with that. Again, I was fortunate. There are plenty of other situations where it could have been a lot more serious, but I'm glad to have learned my lesson in a setting where it was safe. And that's really what inspired me to make this video, because I want to make you all aware of these features that Zoom has put in place to help us keep our meetings safe. So if we just observe a few precautions and a few best practices, we can pretty much avoid this kind of unpleasantness. So thanks again for watching. Keep an eye on this channel. I'm planning on doing another couple of videos about some of the other added features that Zoom has put in since the last update. Thanks very much for your willingness to learn a new skill and to, just sort of expand what it means for us to come together in this time. Thanks again for watching. Have a good one.